Some disappear not to escape justice, but to shield others from the weight of truth. Tonight's mystery begins with a vanished fiancé, a sealed hatch beneath a train, and a silence deeper than guilt. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Let's return to Vauxhall Station, where not every departure is seen, and not every farewell is spoken. It was a quiet morning in early spring, one of those pale-limbed days when the air seemed suspended between seasons, and the city murmured in muffled tones beyond the windows of Baker Street. Holmes had taken his accustomed place by the hearth, legs crossed, eyes half-lidded beneath the smoke-ringed canopy of his pipe. The day's post lay unopened on the table beside him, and I, book in hand, was content to let the hours unfold without purpose. There was a curious stillness about Holmes that morning, not the bristling silence of thought, but a studied patience, as though he awaited something already announced by some private signal. It was in that hush, rich with unsaid things, that I first felt the ripple of a case in the air, though not yet its shape. It was Holmes who broke the calm, rising without remark and moving to the stairwell that led to the street door. He bent swiftly and retrieved 2 items from the carpeted step below. The first a pale lavender handkerchief, delicately edged with lace. The second a single glove, grey kid leather, worn but well kept. He held them up between thumb and forefinger with the expression of a man who has just been handed the preface to a rather intriguing book. "She is late," he murmured, more to himself than to me, "but she has arrived all the same." I rose to examine the items, but Holmes was already turning them over in his hands, his brows knitting with quiet satisfaction. "A narrative, Watson," he said, tapping the glove lightly. "If only one cares to listen to what fabric and habit conspire to tell." Holmes placed the handkerchief upon the arm of his chair and drew my attention to its monogram, E.M., elegantly embroidered in a corner. "A woman of restraint," he began, "one who values propriety over flair. The stitching is of quality, but the hand trembled. See here, an uneven pull in the final letter. She was in haste when she packed it, or already shaken. The glove is damp at the inner wrist, not with rain, but with the warmth of a hand that has been clenched. She has been wringing it nervously, perhaps for several streets." He paused and sniffed the leather. "Lavender oil," he noted, "but faint. She did not apply it today. She travelled by cab, not on foot, and has been waiting outside, hesitating." I must confess I could not follow the rapid cascade of inferences, though each seemed, in his telling, both precise and inevitable. She is young, modest in means, recently engaged, and quite possibly frightened of what she is about to reveal. I stared. Holmes, really? But he only smiled. "Wait for her knock, Watson. I believe you will find her in some distress, and possessing, quite unintentionally, the seed of a most curious puzzle." As though summoned by his words, a sudden knock rang out through the stillness of Baker Street, hurried, sharp, and unmistakably anxious. Holmes did not move. He only looked toward the door and nodded slightly. "That, I believe, will be our Miss E.M., he said calmly. Late, breathless, and uncertain whether to flee or confide. I moved instinctively to answer it, but he gestured for me to wait. "Observe first," he said, "how long she hesitates after the knock, whether she taps again or waits for rescue." There was indeed a pause, a fragile span of seconds, and then the click of a gloved hand on the doorknob. Holmes rose and stepped forward, not as host, but as reader greeting a long-anticipated page. "Let her in, Watson. Her story, I think, has already begun without her." The door opened to reveal a young woman of slender form and pale complexion, her cheeks touched with a bloom that owed more to agitation than to air. She wore a grey travelling coat, slightly dusted at the hem, and removed her remaining glove with hesitant fingers. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, flicked from Holmes to me and back again. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but Holmes forestalled her. "Pray come in, Miss Merrow," he said gently, and the effect upon her was immediate. She blinked, startled. You You know my name. You left it embroidered at my feet, he said with a faint smile, though your presence confirms the rest. Do sit down. You have a great deal to say, and I suspect very little time in which to say it. As she took the chair by the hearth, I saw in her countenance not only alarm, but relief. She had come to the right place. Though she did not yet know what she feared, it had already found her. Miss Eliza Merrow seated herself with a composure that was, at first glance, almost unnatural. She held her handbag close, her gloved fingers resting on its clasp with an odd mixture of determination and fragility. Her eyes, grey, steady, and luminous with something held tightly in check, glanced about the room as though she were memorizing it. One would not have thought her fearful, yet Holmes, ever attuned to undercurrents invisible to the eye, studied her with unusual softness. There was a stillness to her, but it was not calm. It was the restraint of someone who had chosen dignity over panic. Her clothes were modest, practical, of sound fabric and decent cut, and yet I could not help noting the faint fray at the cuff and a button whose stitching had given way. She was, in appearance, a woman neither wealthy nor without education, composed but unguarded, like a soldier fresh from the field, too steady not to have seen danger. When she spoke, it was with a voice low and deliberate, yet it quivered ever so slightly on certain words, as though they had been rehearsed too often in solitude. I am not certain, Mr. Holmes, whether I have come to report a crime or merely a misfortune, she began, her eyes briefly touching mine before returning to Holmes. My fiancé, Mr. Thomas Willoughby, was due to arrive in London yesterday morning. He boarded the early train from Southampton. He did not arrive. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And you are certain he boarded? She opened her bag and produced a small envelope. I received this from a friend of his in Southampton, the porter at the boarding house where he stayed the night. Mr. Willoughby left at 6:30 and was seen entering the station. A ticket was purchased. His trunk was placed aboard. Holmes took the envelope but did not yet open it. But he did not disembark at Vauxhall station. No, sir. I waited and waited. The train pulled in, the passengers stepped down, and the platform cleared. His trunk was retrieved. He was not among them. I had his name called out, even made inquiries with the conductor, but there was nothing. It was as though he had vanished between stations. She said the word with a kind of reluctant conviction, as one who has feared it but did not wish to speak it aloud. Holmes was silent a moment. Then he said gently, "And you are quite sure he would not have abandoned the journey by choice?" Her eyes darkened. Thomas was a man of great honour. He was to meet my guardian today to finalise the settlement. There was no quarrel, no sign. Unless... Holmes raised an eyebrow. Yes, Miss Merrow? She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly. Unless he meant to spare me something, but of that I cannot speak, because I do not know what it could be. Holmes opened the envelope she had passed him. Inside was a folded telegram, addressed to Miss Eliza Merrow at a lodging house near Cavendish Square. It read, "Unable to come as planned. Tell no one. I trust you. Tidieu." Holmes read it twice, then handed it silently to me. The message, though brief, bore a kind of breathless finality. I glanced up to find Miss Merrow watching us with an expression that was not so much expectant as resigned. "It arrived this morning," she said quietly. "No sender's address. The clerk could tell me nothing." "You received this before you came here?" Holmes asked. "Yes. And yet you chose to come." "I had to. I know, this is not mere flight. Thomas would never leave me in disgrace unless he feared for me more than himself." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then rose and moved to the hearth. He stirred the coals absently, but I knew well that his mind had already seized upon the matter in earnest. "Fear," he said softly. Yes, there is fear in this. She glanced toward the window, her voice dropping to near a whisper. I think someone has followed me since I left the station yesterday, or perhaps even before. Holmes turned sharply. Can you describe them? No, I never saw them, only felt them. She stopped speaking, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the faint pop of a coal shifting in the grate. Holmes returned to his chair and folded his hands. He watched her in silence, not unkindly, but with that intense gaze which could peel truth from pretense with no cruelty, only precision. You believe your fiancé vanished of his own volition, he said finally, but under duress. She nodded once. And yet you withhold some suspicion, not because you intend to deceive, but because you fear to name it. She did not deny it. I have found, Holmes continued, that the silences people keep are often more revealing than their words. Yours is a silence born not of ignorance, but of conflict. Miss Merrow's hands folded tightly in her lap. There are parts of Thomas's life he never spoke of, a few names he refused to mention, and one woman I once overheard him speaking to when he thought I slept. He said he could not do it again. I never asked what he meant. Holmes inclined his head thoughtfully. And yet you stayed with him? Yes, she whispered, because I believed that love could forgive whatever came before it. Holmes was silent. The air between them felt charged, but not unkind. I saw that he had drawn a line inward, between logic and sympathy, and that he now stood precisely on its edge. Holmes rose and stepped to the window, his back to us both. He stood for some time in silence, then turned. Miss Merrow, forgive the impertinence, but I must ask plainly, do you suspect that there is another woman in Mr. Willoughby's life? She did not look away. Yes, she said at last, though I do not know her name. Only that she once had power over him, enough to leave him shaken for days after a letter arrived. He burned it before I could see. Did he speak of her? No, never. Holmes nodded slowly. And do you believe this woman may have sought to prevent the marriage? I do not know what to believe, she replied, but I know Thomas was a man tormented by something long past. He was trying to be free of it, of her. And yet, Holmes murmured, the past has a way of arriving precisely when one thinks it buried. He turned back to her, and his tone shifted. We shall find Mr. Willoughby, Miss Merrow. Whether in shame or in danger, he must be brought into the light. But I ask one thing of you. She looked up. When the truth comes, be prepared that it may not resemble the hope that carried you here. Her lips parted, then closed again. She nodded once, and with that, the room fell into a silence heavier than before, the hush before pursuit. The morning air was thick with a persistent drizzle as Holmes and I made our way to Vauxhall station. The streets of London, usually bustling with the careless hurry of daily life, were subdued under the veil of grey clouds, as if the city itself conspired to keep some secret shrouded. Holmes was unusually pensive during the journey, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed not upon the passing scenery, but on the puzzle which had taken root in our minds. Disappearance, he mused quietly, is a far more delicate art than the clumsy application of violence. Often, the vanishing act is but a careful dance of misdirection. I nodded in agreement, sensing that this case would test our powers of discernment as never before. It was not mere chance but design that lay behind the missing gentleman, and Holmes already suspected that the truth would be far more complex than a simple crime. At Vauxhall, we sought out the station porter known to have served on the Southampton line the previous evening. He was a stout man, with a keen eye and a habit of squinting thoughtfully, as though each detail were a thread in some vast tapestry. When asked about Mr. Willoughby, he recalled the gentleman's arrival with surprising clarity. "A man dressed well, sir," he said, "in a dark overcoat and a felt hat, pulled low to shield from the rain. Quiet, polite, but a touch uneasy, if I might say. He carried a small leather satchel and a trunk, which we loaded with care. The porter shook his head firmly when questioned about the man's departure. "No, sir. I never saw him leave the train at Vauxhall. The trunk was taken off, but the gentleman himself was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had stepped off the edge of the world." The man's certainty added a weight to our suspicions. Willoughby's absence was not an oversight, but something more deliberate. Our inquiries led us next to a familiar figure, a blind news seller who frequented the platforms at Vauxhall. Though deprived of sight, he possessed a remarkable acuity for sound and detail, an asset which had aided Holmes on prior occasions. When questioned, the man's face took on a grave expression. "I heard footsteps, sir," he said slowly, hastening between two of the carriages just before the train halted. Not the usual shuffle of passengers, but quick and furtive. Alongside it, a faint metallic rattle, as though a latch or hatch had been disturbed. Holmes's eyes gleamed at this, and he pressed the man for more. But the news seller only shook his head. "Could not see, sir, only hear. The whispers of the station speak in sounds." It was a curious detail, one that suggested Willoughby might have left the train by an unconventional route, perhaps one hidden from common view. Following the blind man's account, Holmes and I examined the gap between two adjacent coaches. There, near a scarcely used maintenance ladder, we found a faint smear of fresh oil on the ironwork, a small but telling sign of recent human activity. Holmes knelt, his fingers tracing the glistening trail. "This," he said, "is no accident. Someone passed here but wished to remain unseen." The ladder descends beneath the platform, leading to service tunnels and perhaps even an exit from the station. We discovered a service panel nearby, its edges disturbed as if recently opened, and yet no one had reported any unusual movement. It was a discovery that suggested collusion, an unseen hand facilitating a disappearance in the heart of London's bustle. This narrow passage might well hold the secret to Mr. Willoughby's vanishing, but it was equally certain that those involved would not suffer exposure lightly. After our examination of the station environs, Holmes directed our attention to the luggage which had been removed from the train at Vauxhall. It was a solitary trunk, weathered but intact, and curiously untouched by the hand of hurried travel. No sign of frantic packing or desperation marred its surface. We found within it a small volume of poetry, bound in worn green leather. On the flyleaf was inscribed in a delicate hand, "To E.M., for the quiet days ahead." The initials matched those embroidered on the handkerchief left at Baker Street. The book was dog-eared and bore faint traces of a lover's frequent caress. Holmes handled it reverently, as if it were a talisman rather than mere paper. "This volume," he remarked softly, "might yet reveal the tenderness beneath the shadow that now cloaked Mr. Willoughby's fate." Among the contents of the trunk, Holmes's keen eye soon spotted a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. It was a receipt from a well-known London bank, dated but the morning of Willoughby's departure. The figure it bore was considerable, £800 in notes withdrawn in cash. Such a sum, Holmes noted, would suffice for a modest escape or a new life begun elsewhere. The timing was no accident, and the motive behind this withdrawal was clearly urgent. Yet it raised more questions than answers. Was this money meant to secure Willoughby's freedom, or was it a ransom to some unseen power? Holmes's face darkened slightly as he folded the receipt carefully away. Financial movements, he said, were often the surest compass through a fog of mystery. We next turned our attention to Willoughby's lodgings in London, a modest flat near the quieter quarters of the city. Upon entry, one was struck by an eerie stillness. Drawers stood open but empty. The hearth was cold, though the ashes bore evidence of a fire recently extinguished. The sparse furniture carried the impression of a man who had fled without haste, but with purpose. Personal effects were scarce, as though he had sought to erase his presence without drawing notice. Holmes paced the room slowly, his eyes surveying every shadow and corner, seeking the slightest clue hidden beneath the calm. This careful abandonment was a puzzle, for it spoke less of panic and more of calculation, a man planning disappearance as an act of preservation rather than despair. In a wastebasket beneath the writing desk, I noticed fragments of paper torn with evident haste and emotion. Gently piecing them together, I discerned a letter, clearly a plea addressed to Willoughby, urging him not to undertake his journey. The handwriting was hurried, the edges ragged, as if ripped in fear or anger. It concluded with a solitary initial, E. The tone was one of desperate entreaty, speaking of danger and consequences too dire to face alone. Holmes examined the scraps with a furrowed brow, his mind already tracing the invisible hand behind this note. The letter spoke of secrets better left undiscovered, and it was clear that the sender's fears were no idle fancy. The unfolding mystery was no mere absence. It was a web of concealed truths and suppressed threats. Holmes spent the better part of the next morning bent over the fragments of the torn letter I had rescued from Willoughby's wastebasket. With his glass and a set of measuring calipers, he studied the slant of each loop and the tremor in each line. I sat by, notebook in hand, yet did not interrupt his meditative silence. At last, he leaned back and addressed me without looking up. "The hand that wrote this," he said, "is female, left-handed, and most likely of middle age or beyond. Note the uneven pressure, particularly on the downward strokes, and the compressed spacing in the final lines. It was written swiftly and with mounting emotional urgency." He tapped the page lightly. Not a letter born of rage, but of dread. She was pleading, not threatening. "And this, Watson," he gestured to the large, looping E that closed the note, "was written not with elegance, but haste." She feared discovery. He looked up at me with that peculiar brightness in his eyes that so often accompanied revelation. "We are no longer looking for a man running from his past, Watson. We are looking for a woman determined to stop him from confronting it." That afternoon, we paid a discreet visit to a solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Holmes had arranged an appointment under the name of a mutual acquaintance. The gentleman who greeted us was of pale complexion and formal bearing, and he glanced uneasily at Holmes's card before ushering us into a quiet chamber. "Yes," he said, when Holmes delicately inquired, "Mr. Willoughby did indeed make certain legal adjustments last week. Specifically, he revised his will." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Might I inquire as to the nature of that change?" The solicitor hesitated, clearly caught between confidentiality and conscience. "I regret that I cannot reveal the beneficiary's name," he said at last. "Mr. Willoughby was firm in his wish for discretion, and I am bound to respect it." Holmes inclined his head. "Quite so. I do not ask you to violate that duty. I ask only this. Was the revision made under duress?" The man's lips parted, then closed again. He looked away. "Let us say that I did not advise the change," he said quietly, "and that I hope, in time, Mr. Willoughby returns to revoke it." That was all he would say, and yet in that reticence, Holmes gleaned more than words could convey. The past, it seemed, had reached through legal formality with a hand still clutching at guilt. Holmes invited Miss Merrow back to Baker Street the following morning, under the pretense of reviewing developments in the case. She arrived punctually, but I noted at once the subtle changes in her manner. Her dress, though neat, was hastily fastened, and the slight tremor in her hands had not abated. Holmes greeted her with courteous restraint and waited until she was seated before speaking. "Miss Merrow, I regret to inform you that Mr. Willoughby withdrew a considerable sum, £800, from his account shortly before he vanished." She started, and I saw colour drain from her cheeks. "800, she whispered. "I had no idea." Holmes watched her closely, not as an accuser, but as a physician might observe a patient's first reaction to diagnosis. "Does that sum suggest anything to you?" he asked. She shook her head, but not convincingly. "Only that he must have been afraid or determined." She looked up then, with eyes that held not merely confusion, but the quiet wound of someone trying to reconcile trust with facts too heavy to ignore. Holmes said nothing more, but I could sense that he, like I, had glimpsed something shifting beneath the surface, something unspoken and urgent. As soon as Miss Merrow had taken her leave, Holmes summoned young Wiggins, an enterprising street lad with a gift for discretion and a network of informants scattered across London's less savoury corners. You are to trace any recent attempts to exchange or deposit notes marked with this serial number, Holmes instructed, handing the boy a copy of the receipt. Pawnbrokers, moneylenders, gaming houses, anywhere a desperate man or woman might go to convert paper into anonymity. Wiggins nodded with a solemnity far beyond his years and vanished into the London fog like a message folded and flung into the wind. Holmes returned to the window and stood in thought. "Follow the money, Watson," he murmured. "If love obscures motive and fear conceals the face, gold will remain stubbornly indifferent to illusion. It leaves a trail, always." That evening, as we reviewed the evidence thus far, Holmes remained unusually quiet. At last he said, "You recall Miss Merrow's reference to a woman from Willoughby's past?" I nodded. "Yes, a shadow, she called her. Never named, but always present." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "It is that silence which troubles me. Miss Merrow is intelligent. If she suspects another woman, as I believe she does, then her omission is intentional. Not out of ignorance, but because the name, if spoken, would change everything." I leaned forward. "Do you believe this woman to be alive still?" Holmes nodded. "More than that, I believe she has already re-entered Willoughby's life, and is the very reason for his disappearance. Whether he fled her or with her remains the open question." He turned to me then. "It is rare, Watson, that a mystery is shaped not by what is said, but by what is carefully not said, and rarer still when the silence is born not of deceit, but of protection." I felt a chill then, not from fear, but from the weight of something just beyond our grasp. The following day, Holmes dispatched a series of quiet inquiries across the city. Names were floated, addresses checked, boarding houses consulted without formal record. By mid-afternoon, a response arrived from a matron at a lodging in Lambeth. "Yes," she wrote, "a lady stayed with us for 3 nights, wore gloves at all times, never gave a name, paid in coin, left yesterday." Holmes's lips pressed into a narrow line. "She was here," he said, "and she has vanished once more." He sent word to the local post office and neighbouring establishments, but no further trace could be found. The woman had come and gone like a shadow. No address left behind, no forwarding message, only the memory of a voice soft with sorrow and hands that refused to bare themselves. "Twice vanished," Holmes murmured, "once from Willoughby's past, and once now from our reach. That is no coincidence." I asked, "Do you believe she is the one who penned the torn letter?" Holmes did not answer directly. "If she is," he said, "then the mystery is not merely about disappearance. It is about identity. And those, Watson, are the most dangerous riddles of all." It was well past midnight when Holmes and I returned to Vauxhall station, wrapped in silence save for the soft ticking of his watch and the far-off clatter of distant freight. The night was cold, and the air bore that peculiar metallic tang one associates with damp rail steel and the secrets of old soot. Holmes had requested a private inspection under the auspices of an acquaintance in the railway office, and we were granted brief access to the now deserted platform. As we passed beneath the awnings and into the gloom between carriages, I could not shake the sense that the very rails beneath us remembered something unspoken. Holmes moved slowly, his lamp held low, his gaze sharp and methodical. "It is in the quiet that men make the noisiest mistakes," he murmured. "This place has seen more than one set of eyes, Watson, one pair watching, another fleeing, and perhaps a third that never wished to see at all. The chill deepened as we descended beside the outer coach, and I began to feel that what we sought was not merely a man's passage, but the deliberate vanishing of truth itself. We paused near the space between the third and fourth carriage, where Holmes had earlier marked the blind news seller's account of fleeing footsteps. There, just beyond the reach of the platform light, he drew my attention to a narrow metal ladder affixed to the undercarriage. Upon one of its lower rungs, smeared against the rusted iron, was a dark stain, fresh, glistening, unmistakable. Holmes crouched without hesitation, drew out a small glass vial, and examined the substance. Blood, he confirmed in a low voice. Still moist. Someone descended here not many hours ago, and not without cost. Beside the stain, pressed faintly on the riveted surface of the service hatch, was the outline of a hand. Long-fingered, the pressure irregular, as if the bearer had leaned heavily against it. He was wounded, or meant to appear so, Holmes said. The line between injury and invention grows thinner the more closely one walks it. I felt a chill that had little to do with the night air. It was a moment suspended, neither proof of death nor survival, only the grim certainty that deception had passed this way. Holmes knocked thrice on a nearby panel, and a few moments later we were joined by a rail maintenance man, a lean and grease-stained fellow whose lanterns swayed with nervous rhythm. Holmes spoke with quiet authority, pointing to the hatch and stain. The man paled. "That's the old service hatch, sir. Leads down beneath the carriages to the utility crawl beneath the track. Not meant for passengers. No one uses it. Dangerous, dark, and nearly forgotten." Holmes asked if it were locked. The man shook his head. "It jams shut sometimes, but no proper lock. Anyone who knew the station well enough might pry it loose." Holmes examined the hinges. "Recently disturbed," he murmured, and with knowledge. He looked up at me. A man does not risk his life on such a path without purpose. Either he feared what stood on the platform, or sought to vanish from all who stood upon it. The railman shifted uncomfortably. "If he went that way, sir, he didn't go alone. Someone would have had to help." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and that, my good man, is what concerns me most." With the maintenance man dismissed, Holmes and I descended the embankment path, some 100 yards beyond the station yard, where the track curved toward the river. The grass was damp with mist, and the moon rode high above the steely surface of the Thames. Near the base of the incline, Holmes halted and stooped low. There, pressed into the mud, were wheel ruts, deep and narrow, not from freight, but from a lighter carriage. Nearby, half buried in weeds, lay a crushed felt hat. Holmes lifted it with care. No monogram, but the size and style matched the porter's description of Willoughby's. He turned it over. Smashed beneath a heel, not lost in flight, but discarded deliberately. I scanned the ground. Could he have leapt from the crawl space and found this waiting? Holmes said nothing at first. Then, he could, and someone brought the carriage. But note, the driver would have needed forewarning. This was no impulse. It was planned. He looked toward the riverbank. He escaped, yes, but not alone. The ruts end here, but the journey did not. Somewhere ahead, someone waited, who knew not only when he would arrive, but why. Holmes stood a long while at the edge of the embankment, the crushed hat still in his hand. Then slowly, he returned to the centre of the rutted path and knelt. With a thin-bladed instrument, he scraped gently at the bloodstain we had observed earlier near the hatch. "Too dark for arterial," he said, and smeared too deliberately. I approached. "Are you suggesting—" He interrupted softly. "Staged, Watson, or rather, exaggerated, enough to suggest struggle, perhaps death. But no trail, no dripping, no drag. He bled, if at all, in a single gesture. Perhaps from a shallow wound, perhaps from none." I looked again at the carriage marks, the discarded hat, the hatch. "A performance," I murmured. "But for whose benefit?" Holmes replied. "For us, for Miss Merrow. For the solicitor, for whomever feared the truth, the blood was his curtain, the undercarriage his trapdoor. His tone grew colder. It is not the flight that concerns me now, Watson. It is the script. Someone rehearsed this scene. And like all plays, it will have a second act. Holmes stood in silence, then turned to me with a gaze sharp as frost. No man vanishes beneath a railway without someone above lifting the hatch, he said. Someone within the station, trusted, invisible, enabled this passage. An accomplice, silent by duty or by coin. He stepped away from the ladder and replaced his gloves. Such things do not happen by accident. They happen by arrangement. And the deeper the silence surrounding them, the louder the truth must become when spoken. We began our return to Baker Street, and in Holmes's measured stride, I sensed the momentum of a case no longer veiled in mystery, but in human intent. It was on a Tuesday morning, grey and windless, that Holmes emerged from his room clad in the faded garments of a tradesman, corduroy trousers, an oilskin coat, and a cap drawn low to shadow his features. "I shan't require your company for the next hour, Watson," he said calmly. "There is a woman in Lambeth who knows more than she has admitted to any soul, herself included." He departed without further explanation. When next I saw him, 3 hours had passed, and the weather had turned, the air now damp with early drizzle. Holmes entered with boots, muddy and coat spattered, but his eyes were gleaming. "Number 17, Cheney Row," he said, removing his cap. "Boarding house. 4 rooms, 1 attic chamber, and a landlady who forgets little save her own guilt. She saw him, Watson. She spoke with him, and she remembers his voice." He did not elaborate further, but I saw that the trap, carefully set, had now begun to close around a truth more complicated than a mere elopement or vanishing act. Holmes, as he recounted later, had approached the modest boarding house in the guise of a chimney sweep's clerk, knocking softly and inquiring after rooms for a visiting tradesman from Nottingham. But it was not the request that stirred the landlady. It was his voice. "That's him," she had said suddenly, halting mid-sentence. "That's the gentleman who took the attic 3 nights ago, paid in silver, said little, but had the same sound to his speech, calm and careful." Holmes allowed the silence to stretch before replying in his natural tone, which only unsettled her more. "He left no name," she continued, "but I remember how he watched the door, wouldn't let me up with coal or wash, and always waiting." Holmes asked, "Waiting for whom?" She hesitated. "A woman, gloves, dark veil, never gave a name either. She came the second night and left just before dawn." He opened the door for her, like a man who owed her his breath. Holmes thanked her and took his leave. As he told me later, it was not the story she had given, but the one she dared not invent, that told him the most. The attic room itself, Holmes said, had been stripped of almost all trace. No papers, no garments, not even a shaving kit or borrowed book. But the scent of lavender still lingered faintly in the curtains, and a cracked saucer bore the mark of 2 teacups recently rinsed, but not dried. "She came, Watson," Holmes told me, "and he was expecting her, but not joyfully. The bed remained untouched. The chair by the window was worn at one arm, as if by a man who sat for hours without moving. This was not reunion, it was confinement. The woman with gloves is not his accomplice, but his jailer." I asked if the landlady had overheard their conversation. "Only silence," Holmes replied. "And that is far more telling. A silence of weight, not comfort. They said what could not be said aloud, or else said it once long ago, and now only repeated it with their eyes. I could not help but feel that a shadow greater than scandal lay upon that room, something that would not be confessed except by accident or mistake." Later that evening, as we sat by the fire with our notes scattered about the rug, Holmes recounted the details of his visit with the curious air of a man following a line too delicate to fully voice. He paid in coin, always a cautious choice. No name, no address. He burned no candles. left no papers. He had come not to stay, but to wait. And now he is gone again. I leaned forward. Do you believe he left with her? No, Holmes replied, but he expected to, until something changed. He paused, turning over a small piece of lint between his fingers. It is the absence that intrigues me, not of the man, but of a word, a single name, Watson, one she never uttered aloud, yet it haunts the entire affair. He did not yet say what that name might be, but in his manner I knew it had already begun to form behind the veil of deduction. The next morning, Holmes composed a brief note to Miss Merrow, requesting her presence once more at Baker Street, under the pretense of having located the whereabouts of her fiancé. She arrived promptly, composed yet faintly flushed, and accepted tea without comment. Holmes's demeanour was gracious, even warm, and he gestured for her to sit. "We have made progress, Miss Merrow," he said, "though I fear the trail is not yet complete. It may interest you to know that Mr. Willoughby revised his will some days before his disappearance, leaving all to a woman named Eleanor Merrow." There was a pause, longer than necessary, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "Eleanor?" she repeated, her voice low. "That cannot be correct." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "It is written plainly. But my middle name is Margaret," she said. "Eleanor is no part of it." Holmes offered no reaction, only a quiet, "Ah," and turned the conversation to less pressing matters. But I saw it then, the brief flicker of awareness in his eyes, the way he noted her instinctive response, the measured cadence of her breath. The bait had been taken, not with alarm, but with that fragile confusion born of memory meeting revelation. Miss Merrow had said it lightly, almost in passing, but the weight of the correction struck Holmes as a note too precise to be casual. "Margaret," she had said with the ease of someone who had carried that truth her entire life. Yet there had been no flicker of recognition at the name Eleanor, no suggestion it had ever been hers, or even close. And it was then, as the door shut softly behind her, that Holmes turned to me with a look of quiet satisfaction. "It was never Eliza, Watson," he said. "Not truly, or not entirely." I did not yet understand, but Holmes did not press the point. He lit his pipe and returned to his seat by the fire, content to let the seed grow until the fruit was ripe enough to pluck. Holmes sat in thoughtful silence long after Miss Merrow's departure, the morning's encounter resting upon his mind like an unsolved cipher. At length, he said, "It begins to resolve itself, Watson. All of it. Willoughby's disappearance, the torn letter, the silence around a single name, and like most enigmas, it hinges not upon fact, but upon identity. One woman with two faces, or two women with one past. But not yet, not yet." He leaned back, eyes half closed, smoke rising around him. "The letter E, Watson. It is the only letter that tells the truth and dares not say it aloud." 2 days after Miss Merrow's final visit, Holmes composed a letter which I found oddly familiar in tone. The hand, though not his own, mimicked with astonishing accuracy the clipped, thoughtful style of Thomas Willoughby. It was brief and to the point. "Meet me at the boarding house at 7:30. There is something you must know, and I cannot write it. Come alone." When I inquired as to the purpose of this deception, Holmes merely replied, "A net must match its prey, Watson, and this one is made of silence and misdirection." The letter, delivered through a neutral hand, was not sent to Miss Merrow, but rather to an anonymous contact Holmes had identified through quiet inquiry, a woman who had once claimed residence under a name now struck from every registry. "She will come," Holmes said with certainty. "If she believes he awaits her, she cannot stay away." He said no more that day, but in his stillness I recognized the anticipation of a man who had baited a trap not for guilt, but for identity, We took our positions across the street from the boarding house well before the appointed hour. Holmes stood motionless in the shadows, his eyes never leaving the lamplit door. I, beside him, watched with mounting tension as the minutes passed. At 7:25, a hansom drew up quietly to the curb. From it stepped a woman dressed in a dark travelling cloak, her face obscured by a veil. She did not look around but moved with confident familiarity toward the entrance. There was something in the movement that struck me. A posture, a bearing, so strangely reminiscent of Eliza Merrow that I gasped aloud. Holmes nodded slowly, without surprise. "Yes," he murmured. "It is not merely resemblance, Watson. It is lineage." The landlady opened the door with apparent recognition, and the figure stepped inside. Holmes placed a hand on my arm. "Come," he said. "The curtain rises." In that moment, I felt that we were no longer investigators, but witnesses to a private history, one too long buried and too carefully stitched into silence. The scene we entered was tense with the charged quiet of withheld emotions. Willoughby stood in the centre of the modest parlour, pale and rigid. Before him stood the woman in the veil, her gloved hands clasped tightly, though her voice, when it came, was steady and without tremor. "You sent for me," she said, her tone neither welcoming nor accusatory. Willoughby flinched. "Eleanor," he breathed, and the name hung there like a spectre drawn from the walls. She removed her veil. The resemblance to Eliza was undeniable. Older, yes, and wearied by years perhaps harsher than her sister had known, but the same grey eyes, the same line of jaw and cheek. "You never meant to face me," she said. "You thought you could vanish again. This time, behind another name, behind her." Willoughby lowered his head. "I did not know," he whispered. "Not at first. But when I saw her, when I began to care, it was too late." The pain in his voice was not theatrical, but real, raw, and unguarded. Eleanor turned to Holmes and me with composed defiance. "You wished for truth. Very well. I am Eleanor Merrow, and he tried to erase me." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. What followed was not a confrontation in the ordinary sense, but a slow, devastating unravelling of shared memory. Eleanor spoke with precision, each word calibrated not for drama, but for accuracy. "He promised to marry me," she said, "before the war, before the scandal, but when my father discovered the child," she paused, "he sent me away. Thomas never wrote again." Willoughby's voice cracked. "I thought you dead. They told me you had gone to Paris, that you refused help." "No," she interrupted. "They lied, and when I returned, I found your name linked to hers. My sister, adopted, raised in comfort, unaware of me, of us." Willoughby reached into his coat and retrieved a folded parchment. "You wanted me to change the will. I did. But I could not, I would not, destroy her." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You withdrew £800. For her?" "To disappear," Willoughby replied. "To spare Eliza the shame of discovery. To give Eleanor silence in place of justice." Eleanor's expression did not change. "Silence is not mercy, Mr. Holmes. It is control." Holmes said nothing then, but the room seemed colder for it. It was Holmes who finally stepped forward, his voice calm and unmistakably final. "Miss Merrow, Eleanor, your grievances are heard. But the law, unlike the heart, requires more than pain. A will revised under emotional coercion is not valid in equity or conscience." He held out a folded document, another copy, one that had not been deposited at the solicitor's office. "This is the original draft," he said, "unaffected, unaltered. Willoughby never filed the revision. He gave you what you asked for, but not in form, only in gesture." Eleanor did not reach for it. She simply stared. You mean to say I have nothing? Holmes gave a slight bow. Only what you came with, and what remains in memory. Willoughby turned toward her, his face stricken. I could not, would not, let you ruin her, not even to repair what we lost. For a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of choice, of guilt, and the cost of silence seemed suspended in the air. Then Eleanor straightened her cloak. Then it is finished. Holmes did not stop her as she turned for the door, and perhaps, in that restraint, he gave her the only justice possible. As the door closed softly behind her, I remained still, struck by the ghostly symmetry of the sisters, one raised in security, the other in shadow, both entangled by a man whose guilt had not faded with time. I could not help but wonder how Eliza would receive the truth, or whether it would ever reach her at all. Holmes stood by the window, his expression unreadable. Some inherit legacies, he said. Others are buried beneath them. But even the buried can rise, if only to cast one last shadow. I did not answer. For the first time, I feared that he was right. It was late in the afternoon when we returned to Baker Street, the winter light casting long shadows across the parlour floor. Holmes said little as he settled into his chair, the familiar pipe between his fingers and a far-off look in his eyes. I too was subdued, shaken, perhaps, not by the revelations themselves, but by the quiet devastation they had left in their wake. After some time, Holmes stirred and reached for the worn volume of railway maps on the table beside him. He opened it without urgency, more for rhythm than for reference. You see, Watson, he said finally, there was never a crime, not in the legal sense, but there was concealment, a vanishing not out of fear for one's life, but for one's legacy. He glanced toward the fire. Willoughby was not abducted, nor coerced into hiding. He orchestrated the entire departure himself, with Eleanor's reluctant assistance. I leaned forward. And the blood, the discarded hat. Holmes nodded. Part of the stagecraft, the illusion of violence where none existed. Every clue pointed to escape, not pursuit. The question was never who harmed him, but why he needed to vanish at all. Holmes rose from his chair and paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Willoughby, as we have learned, was once bound to Eleanor Merrow, not merely by affection, but by history. Their youthful indiscretion, as such things are delicately termed, resulted in a child. But society, in its wisdom, shrouded the matter in silence. Eleanor was removed, the child placed with another family, and so the page was turned. He paused, until the past refused to remain in its place. He gestured lightly. Miss Eliza Merrow, intelligent, compassionate, and utterly unaware, was that child. She grew up under a name borrowed from blood, but not from memory. I felt a chill settle over me. And Eleanor? Holmes's face was unreadable. Returned not for vengeance, but for recognition. She saw in Eliza not a rival, but a replacement, living the life she had been denied. And when Willoughby, unaware at first, began to love the daughter of his former love, Eleanor's pain transformed into leverage. He turned back toward the fire. And so the vanishing was planned, not to flee a threat, but to protect two women from a truth neither could bear to name. Holmes's words settled upon me with the weight of tragic inevitability. I recalled Eliza's gentleness, her composed sorrow, her confusion at the storm that had overtaken her life. Does she know? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. The knowledge would wound far more than it would clarify. What comfort lies in learning that the man one loves was once bound to another, not merely in promise, but in paternity. He sank into his chair once more. Willoughby learnt the truth only days before the wedding. A letter, long misdelivered, reached him. In it, Eleanor laid bare the facts. The child, the adoption, the betrayal. She did not ask for reparation, only recognition. I stared into the fire. the light flickering across the pages of our case notes, and so he chose to vanish. Precisely, Holmes said. He could not marry her, his daughter, nor could he bear to destroy the illusion of their happiness. Disappearance was the only mercy he could offer, to her, to Eleanor, and to himself. The silence that followed was not one of triumph, but of quiet mourning. The case was solved, but no one, it seemed, had truly been spared. Holmes leaned forward and tapped the edge of the fire grate with the tip of his pipe. Eleanor Merrow, for all her bitterness, did not return with vengeance in her heart. She returned with hunger, for recognition, for justice, and perhaps for the faint echo of a life once promised. He stood. She did not demand money. She demanded acknowledgement. When Willoughby refused, whether from fear or guilt, she threatened to expose the truth, not merely to Eliza, but to society. The scandal would have destroyed them all. He turned toward the window, but her anger was not baseless. She had been cast into silence, erased from the ledger of memory, and when she saw her sister living in respectability, ignorant and adored, her pain took on a shape it had never known before. It became strategy. I said softly. She forced his hand. Holmes nodded. Indeed, the revised will, the blood, the carriage, they were pieces of a bargain. She agreed to help him vanish, and in return he promised her inheritance and silence. But the human heart does not bargain cleanly, Watson. It resents its own concessions. His gaze drifted. She did not want his money. She wanted to be remembered. I produced the banker's receipt from the file beside me. The £800, Eleanor believed it to be for her. Holmes gave a faint smile. So did we. But Willoughby was clever. The sum was divided into 3 envelopes, each bearing the name of a discreet contact in 3 different cities. Lodgings, transport, new identities. He had no intention of eloping, only of vanishing. He walked to the bureau and unfolded a small map. Each route avoided Eliza, Eleanor, and London entirely. He meant to retreat into obscurity, to live out his years in self-imposed exile. He tapped a city on the southern coast. Lisbon was his intended refuge. From there, a steamer to the colonies. I stared at the name. And did he go? No, Holmes said. He was intercepted, not by us, but by conscience. He folded the map again. Willoughby sent word to me the day after the confrontation. He remains in hiding, but close. He will not leave until I assure him that the matter is settled. He awaits, Watson, not freedom, but forgiveness, which, I fear, neither woman may ever give. I was silent. There was no justice in such a tale. Only mercy, imperfect and unspoken. It was Holmes's brother, Mycroft, who saw to the affair's final resolution. With the quiet efficiency for which he was both admired and feared, he arranged for Eleanor Merrow's departure under a new name, with modest provision and no questions asked. She is to disappear again, Holmes remarked, but this time with consent rather than compulsion. There was no formal report, no trial, no scandal, just a silent excision of a name from a page it had never truly belonged to. Some truths, Holmes said, must not be buried, but neither must they be shouted. They are to be set down, sealed, and placed where only time can read them. When Eliza Merrow was finally told that Thomas Willoughby had left England of his own will, her face changed in a way I have never forgotten, not with anger, but with a sorrow too vast for tears. He could not love me, she said, not without shame. But Holmes shook his head gently. He loved you precisely because of it, and that is why he left. She made no reply, only nodded, and quietly departed our sitting room. I never saw her again. Some stories end with triumph, others with resolution. But some, like this, end with the ghost of a kiss that was never given and a question never answered. In the days that followed the close of our singular engagement with Mr. Thomas Willoughby, I found myself haunted not by the sensation of crime averted, nor by the thrill of deduction achieved, but by the subtle ache of something far more human and unresolved. The affair, when viewed in legal terms, produced no corpse, no stolen treasure, no enemy brought to book, and yet there had been damage, profound, indelible damage, wrought not with a blade but with silence, with the gradual corrosion of truth beneath years of genteel decorum. I had long believed, perhaps naively, that cases most often emerged from the underworld, from crooked hands and malicious minds. But this was a wound born not of wickedness, but of decorum itself, of the need to keep a gentleman's name clean, a lady's dignity intact, and a child's past unspoken. Behind the pressed lapels and polite vows of society, I saw, through Holmes's lens, a seam of fear, fear of disgrace, fear of memory, fear of love that does not fit into sanctioned lines. Such cases do not leave the air ringing with triumph. They end, rather, in the hushed corners of drawing rooms and the unswept corners of the mind, and it is there that they remain. That evening, our fire burned low, casting amber shadows across the cluttered floor of Baker Street. Holmes, so often invigorated by a successful investigation, sat uncharacteristically still, the bow of his violin resting across his knees, untouched. His fingers moved idly along its neck, not to play, but in unconscious rhythm, as though trying to find some note he could not summon. For a long while, I remained silent, unwilling to disturb what I sensed was no ordinary reverie. I had seen Holmes retreat into quietude before, when minds had bested him or justice had faltered, but this silence was of another sort. It was not the calm after intellectual exertion, but the hush of a man turning over some private sorrow that had brushed too near. When he spoke at last, his voice was low and strangely distant. There is no formula, Watson, for the pain that memory exacts. One may calculate a man's motive, trace a footprint to its source, match ink to hand, but no science measures what a man must bury to survive. I looked up, startled. Do you regret aiding him? He shook his head. No, but I wonder sometimes whether in restoring silence we also preserve sorrow. Holmes rose from his chair and approached the mantelpiece, where he stood for a long moment gazing into the fire's waning glow. His eyes, usually quick and bright, seemed now to reflect the embers themselves, flickering, receding, but not yet cold. Truth, when spoken aloud, he said slowly, has the power to destroy more than it clarifies. We are trained, you and I, to seek it out, to pry it from dark corners and drag it blinking into daylight, and yet... He paused, his expression unreadable. Some truths are not lies, but protections, not denials, but kindnesses unspoken. He turned then and looked at me directly. Willoughby did not vanish from guilt. He vanished from fear. Fear that in remaining he would ruin what little good had been wrought from old mistakes. The love he bore for Eliza was not criminal, nor was it false, but it was impossible. And in recognizing that impossibility, he chose disappearance over destruction. There was silence for a moment. In some cases, Holmes continued, we chase shadows believing them to be villains, only to find in the end that they are merely the outlines of men trying not to harm the ones they love. It was Holmes who suggested we return once more to Vauxhall, 2 mornings after our final correspondence with Mycroft had assured Eleanor's quiet departure. There was no business that demanded it, no evidence to retrieve or contact to meet, and yet I understood at once. Some places do not relinquish their mysteries without a second glance in daylight. The station had shed its spectral quiet of nights past. It bustled with industry, alive with the noises of London on the move. but beneath its motion there lingered, for those who knew to feel it, a residual hush, a kind of atmospheric footprint. We stood upon the same platform where weeks before Willoughby had ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. The hatch was now sealed, the tracks unremarkable, and yet Holmes surveyed it all with the focused solemnity he reserved for cathedrals or murder scenes. Here, he murmured, he unmade himself, not in fear of the law, but in fear of himself. I said nothing. We watched as the train pulled away, bearing hundreds whose lives continued untouched, unaware of the private tragedies that sometimes unfold beside their hurried steps. It seemed to me a place no longer haunted, but still echoing. Near the edge of the platform, a porter swept diligently with a long-handled broom, his shoulders bowed in habitual motion. He did not glance at us as we passed. If he had any memory of the strange event that had once unfolded under his very nose, it was not written on his face. "Do you suppose," I asked quietly, "he suspects anything of what occurred here?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "No more than the postman who delivers love letters, or the footman who serves tea during a quarrel. The world is full of those who carry truth unwittingly." He paused. "It is their innocence that allows these deceptions to survive." The porter coughed, leaned on his broom, and resumed his slow progress across the stone. Holmes watched him with the sort of expression I had seen only rarely, a gaze that held not deduction, but empathy, as though he, too, wished at times to be such a man, burdened only with dust and debris, never with the weight of memory. We remained a while longer, though there was nothing left to learn. It was not knowledge Holmes sought that morning. It was farewell. To the place, to the story, and perhaps to something in himself. As we departed the station that morning, Holmes and I walked some distance before exchanging a single word. The noise of London resumed its customary roar around us, carriages clattering, voices hailing, commerce thudding onward. But between us, silence stretched long and unbroken. It was I who spoke first, more to break the hush than to articulate any firm thought. "Some mysteries," I said, "do not end with arrests or confessions." Holmes inclined his head. "No, some end with understanding, and some with the absence of it." I reflected on Eliza's soft grief, on Eleanor's fierce sorrow, on Willoughby's quiet exile. There had been no victor, no perfect resolution, merely a rearrangement of truths too delicate to survive exposure. "I shall write it," I said after a time, "but I doubt I shall publish it." Holmes gave a small nod. "Perhaps that is best. Not all cases are meant for the public mind. Some, like this, are for memory alone. And so it has remained. A story not of evil, but of silence. A silence which, though the years have passed, does not leave the mind entirely. For even in the light of day, some shadows linger, unspoken, but never quite gone." As we departed Vauxhall station, the clatter of the morning trains echoing behind us, Holmes walked in contemplative silence. At last, as we turned into the main road, he spoke, not with triumph, but with something akin to sorrow. "Watson," he murmured, "men will do monstrous things to protect their secrets, but occasionally it is not malice that drives them underground, but mercy. To vanish willingly, to shoulder disgrace in silence, is sometimes the cost of shielding another from unbearable knowledge." I glanced at him, struck by the quiet gravity in his voice. "And yet," I said, "the truth was bound to surface." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, but not all truths are meant to be punished. Some are merely meant to be borne. What do you believe Eleanor's true motive was? Blackmail, revenge, or a desperate bid to reclaim a life she believed stolen? I'd love to know your thoughts. Leave a comment with your theory. And if this tale stirred something in you, don't forget to like, share with a fellow mystery lover, and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows with Sherlock Holmes.